Hello, and welcome to Watercolor Landscapes, presented by Plano Public Library. Today, we are going to go over a brief history of watercolor and how it came to be used for landscape paintings. We are going to go over a specific compositional technique called the rule of thirds. We are also going to go over the basics of atmospheric perspective and learn how to create the illusion of depth in our paintings. We will quickly talk about the materials we are using for today's class, and then we will start our watercolor paintings of two different landscapes. We will be switching back and forth between the two while we wait for the other one to dry. Watercolor art dates back to the cave paintings of Paleolithic Europe, which makes sense when you think of cave paintings. They had pigment and they dissolved it using water. It has been used for manuscript illustration since at least the Egyptian times, although it did take particular prominence in the European Middle Ages. During the German Northern Renaissance, artist Albrecht Dürer painted several fine botanical, wildlife, and scientific illustrations, and Dürer is generally considered among the earliest examples of artists who used watercolor as a serious medium, as opposed to just using watercolor as a sketch or a study. At the end of the 18th century, a great many artistic societies developed centered around watercolor, which aimed to promote the use of watercolor among both professional and amateur artists. Thanks to the development of the Grand Tour of Europe, many people were traveling to new places and sought to capture the sights that they were seeing. As this was before the advent of photography, many engaged in watercolor painting, as it was portable and easy enough to pick up. There also grew the rise of the concept of picturesque paintings, such as landscapes, which usually included ruins, trees, and water sources composed on the paper to depict an aesthetically pleasing view. Composition is important to catch attention, and it can create a dynamic, tranquil, or animating effect of the subject matter. Historically, artists have used various compositional techniques to arrange the subjects of their works and create balance and harmony. The rule of thirds is a popular compositional technique for landscapes, and it comes from the rules of creating a picturesque landscape. How the rule of thirds works is we create a tic-tac-toe grid, dividing our paper into a grid with 3 rows and 3 columns. The goal is to place objects of interest in the intersecting points and any long horizontal or vertical pieces along the lines. In this example, we have the rock located on the bottom left intersection point of the grid, and the hill is located on the upper right intersection point. The horizon line lines up with the top horizontal line, and the edge of the pool lines up mostly with the bottom horizontal line. While this picture features a cityscape, I also wanted to show how you could place vertical objects on those grid lines to create an interesting composition. Here, the vertical struts of the bridge are lined up with the left vertical grid line, and the intersection between the vertical strut and the road of the bridge aligns with the bottom left intersection point on our grid. Atmospheric perspective, sometimes known as aerial perspective, is about creating an illusion of depth. While examples of this kind of perspective have been around since antiquity, Leonardo da Vinci is the one credited with being the first to write down the principles of atmospheric perspective. Atmospheric perspective is all about recreating the illusion of air and atmosphere. You'll often see in paintings that objects that are further away are paler, and we can recreate this effect in watercolor by using more water and less pigment for objects that are further away. Objects will also appear to be less detailed and more blurry the further away they are. Watercolor has a great way of mimicking this effect using a wet-on-wet technique that we'll play around with in our landscapes today. We can also try to mimic this by using bigger brushes and brush strokes, compared to objects that are closer that will have more fine detail and have smaller brush strokes. Objects in the distance will also appear more blue. This is because of how light refracts in the particles of our atmosphere. There's usually lots of water, which tends to refract blue. In watercolor, we can mimic this by using blue pigments. Even green and purple, which have blue in them, will recede in the distance. Objects in the distance will also have less contrast. This means that there are less differences between light and shadow. In our example image, you can see the mountain in the back has areas of shadow that are just slightly darker than the areas of white. Closer objects, on the other hand, will be more detailed. You can see the detail of the brush strokes in the trees. They have fine little lines compared to the brush strokes of the mountain shadows. Closer objects will also have more vivid colors and contrast. Typically, objects in the front will be the darkest, like our trees in this example image. The closer you want an object to appear, the more red you will use. This is a bit of a color theory thing. Blue tends to recede on the page, while red appears to come towards the viewer. You can see in our example landscape that there are a few patches of brown, which is a darkish red-orange on the grass in the front. And this helps with the illusion that the grass is the frontmost object. Here's another example of atmospheric perspective. You can see the trees in the distance appear to be blurry as though they were behind a fog. This is because of the wet-on-wet technique I mentioned earlier. You'll also notice more of that reddish-orangish brown in the foreground to help the foreground appear closer to the viewer. Today, we will be using a variety of brushes and water brush pens. Water brush pens are brushes with water in the barrel that you can squeeze out. I wanted to use these for our watercolor landscapes class because I do think they increase the portability of watercolor. And I hope you can see how you can pack a few water brush pens and your palette and go out into nature and paint outside. However, there is no substitute for the kinds of textures you can achieve with some of our more traditional brushes, so we'll be using those as well. We are using 140-pound cold-pressed paper, which has been taped down to our boards with drafting tape. This will hopefully reduce some of the warping we typically encounter when using lots of water on paper. We are also going to be using tissue paper and sponges to absorb moisture, and at times lift up our pigment. This is because we'll want to create that hazy, faded look for distance to mimic that atmospheric perspective. Our landscapes today are inspired by this mountainscape and this scene of forest foliage. You can see in the mountainscape that the mountain in the distance is fairly hazy. We have some high contrast on the hillside closest to us. This composition is one we are going to have to crop and adjust just a bit. Notice how much wider this picture is compared to our paper. I like keeping the houses on the bottom left intersection point, and the peak of the far mountain will be on the right vertical grid line. In this scene of forest foliage, you can see we have a hazy, pale, far away point. We are going to keep that atmospheric perspective and focus on making the trees in the front look more detailed than the trees in the back. We are also going to experiment with color and try to recreate the vivid colors we see here that fade away to a more greenish color in the middle. Let's get started. I have here a copy of my inspiration images that I'm going to set off camera to the left. We are going to start by sketching a brief outline of our main composition. To start, I'm going to draw a diagonal line that mimics the close hillside to us. And it's just going to come across somewhat diagonally to me. I think I went a little bit too far down. I'm still imagining this tic-tac-toe grid in my mind. And around this point, I want the hill to kind of flatten out a little bit so that we can have those houses. And then I want it to go down once again. While I'm still imagining the tic-tac-toe grid with the vertical lines, I'm going to find where the mountain in the back intersects the hillside closest to us. And I'm going to start sketching it. I also want to include this road, this little windy road. And I'm also going to give myself a few lines to indicate where the hillside kind of breaks into shadow. With those lines, our mountain is done, and I'm going to rotate over to our forest scene. Once again, I'm imagining those grid lines, and kind of in the bottom left corner, I'm going to outline very lightly where I want that hazy faraway point to be. I'm going to draw a light line from the corners of that hazy point to indicate the road. And then I'm going to draw a few trees. I'm mostly focusing on the trunks. I don't need to worry too much about the branches. I just want to get these rough shapes in so that I know that I'll need to leave some spots uncovered by leaves. Okay, flipping back over, we are going to get started with watercolor. One thing I should have mentioned first is that I really like to activate my watercolors before I start painting with them. What this means is I like to add a few drops of water into each watercolor pan just to let the pigment loosen up in the water and let it be a lot easier to pick up. So for this, I'm using one of my water brush pens, and I am just squeezing it to add 3 to 4 droplets of water into each pan. And this uses up a lot of water, but it's really good and it helps your watercolor lift up and be more vibrant on the page. I am actually going to use my water brush for the sky of the mountain area. You can see my water brush pen is very wide, and I like this width because it lets me cover a larger area than if it was just a skinny point. And with my water brush, the first thing that I'm going to do is I am just going to squeeze out some water onto my paper. And honestly, without any pigment, I am just letting the water spread onto the surface of my paper. Because we'll want some gradation and some ombre effects in our sky, we'll want to make sure that our paper is wet so that we can get a very nice blend of color. So with that done, I am going to start dipping into my colors. The first color I'm going to use is this ultramarine blue I've got here. And I'm going to dip in a few times. Then I'm also going to use some cyan blue, which hopefully mixes with my ultramarine quite nicely. And finally, I'm going to use some purple. And with that, our sky is pretty much done. We just have to wait for it to dry a little bit. But while it's drying, I think that it's a good idea for us to do a little bit of an underpainting on our mountains. Now, in the example image of the mountains, the hillside closest to us is this really nice, warm, vibrant green, and it looks like the sun is just shining on it and lighting it up so nice. So to get that nice sun-baked color, we're actually going to use our yellow. And this is a lemon yellow color in my palette. And I am going to spread that yellow onto my mountain. Later on, we are going to go over this color with green, but it helps to have a little bit of yellow underneath so that you really get that richness of color, that layered color. And I'm not worried about going all the way down to the bottom. I can see that my hillside has a lot of shadow in it, so I'm not too worried about that. Now, I see that the sun is also shining on the mountain in the back. However, I don't necessarily want to use the same rich, vibrant, bright yellow color that I used on the hillside closest to me. So, rinsing out my yellow, I am going to use this yellow ochre color. Yellow ochre is a little bit muddier, it's a little bit less vibrant, and I'm just going to use it on that back mountain. To give it the appearance of some sunlight poking through. And again, I'm not worried about completely filling in all of the lines. We're going to have some trees over here. We are going to come in with some other layers as well. And we really do want this top edge of the mountain to be nice and dark. But I think this underpainting of the yellow will really help give us that sun-drenched look that the landscape is in. Because the colors are so blended and so vibrant in this forest scene, we are going to use a wet on wet technique in this scene as well. So once again, I've just got my water brush and it should have no pigment on it. And I am just running water over the whole thing, making sure that I'm really squeezing that barrel and putting a lot of water onto my paper. Because when I put the pigment on the paper, I really want it to bleed and spread. So if you kind of lean back, you'll want your paper to look shiny. And then I'm going to come in with some of my vermilion red, and I'm going to start dipping and spreading wherever I see that color on my reference image. And I see it in a lot of places. You can see because we're using the wet on wet technique, the color is wanting to just kind of spread and it's bleeding, which is what we want. We also want to include a lot more color on there. So I'm going to use this burnt umber color, or no, burnt sienna, sorry. and include that in my painting. I'm also going to come back with some of that yellow ochre. And I am just dabbing onto the paper and really letting the wetness of my paper spread the color around. I also see some green, so we definitely don't want to forget about that. I'm using sap green at the moment, and it is a little bit duller than I would like. I also have this deep green, which I think is going to be a nice, vibrant shock of color. We don't want to use too much of it. And I'm trying to leave this hazy spot alone, but you can see some of my paint has already spread there. That is fine. I have some paper towels, which I can use to kind of dab at this area. And I don't mind some green getting into the hazy area. We do want some color in the back, but we want to keep that area relatively clear. I'm going back in with more of my vermilion. I'm just making sure I really get a nice vibrant color. I'm also realizing I have been ignoring the ground completely. So I'm going to be adding some vermilion and some crimson to my path, my ground. And I think as I'm looking at this image, I really want more of that yellow ochre color, so I'm going to come back in with it and spread it. There is no perfect way to do this. You just kind of look at the colors that are forming on your piece of paper and decide where you want more of one color or where you want more of the other. As it is, I think that's looking like a nice baseline for our underpainting for the forest scene. We are going to come back on top of this and add leaf textures and our trees, of course, but I think this is a very good start for our leaf background layer. I'm noticing some water pooling up, so I'm just going to dab with my paper towel at those pools of water to help it dry up just a little bit more. I'm not necessarily trying to lift the pigment up, I'm just trying to dry some of that water up. And then we will turn our paper back over to work more on our mountain scene. So this next part is a little bit funny. We are going to be scratching into the watercolor paper. This is a technique called sgraffito. And when we scratch into the watercolor paper, what we are doing is we are creating channels so that when we brush over them later on, the watercolor will want to pool in these channels and it will create darker areas. So looking at our hillside, we have a lot of areas of darkness, and I am going to take the cap of my water brush pen and I am just digging that cap into my paper. And I am attempting to dig these channels in. I'm noticing there's not very many super long lines, so I'm not doing one solid straight line. I'm doing a lot of short little lines into our hillside. Okay. And we'll see what that does in a minute because we are going to take our water brush once again. And I am going to go over this close mountainside with a sap green color. I'm just dipping my pen into the sap green. And spreading it. And anytime I need more water, I'm just pressing my water barrel. Just making sure I get that nice green color covering my mountain. And here you can see all of our hard work paid off. The lines that we had carved in with our pen cap are definitely showing up darker, and you can see a lot more detail already, even though all that we've done is just a wash over the underpainting of yellow underneath. Okay, with that, I am finally going to retire my wide brush water pen. It's been a valiant soldier, but the time has come for others to continue on. So I've rotated the forest back over, and now we are going to try to add leaves. And for this, we can use a multitude of brushes. I really like this fan brush. I think that it comes up with some really nice textures when you just use the fan. I also really like using the water brush again, but this time just a pointy water brush. This one allows me to get many different sizes of leaves. And one thing that I want us to note is that as we get closer to the center, especially on the ground of our path, we will want to create many small leaves with our watercolor. So the leaves in the back are going to be much smaller than the leaves in the front, which can be used with larger brush strokes. And the same goes for the trees. So the trees in the front towards us are going to have larger leaves than the trees in the back. So going in, this time we are not using a wet on wet technique, but we are still using watercolor on this. I like looking at these splotches, and if I see a spot of vermilion red, I'm not going to go over it again with a spot of vermilion red. I might go over it with some yellow ochre. And I'm just letting the brush do the work. And create some leaf textures in that spot. Similarly, if I see a spot of yellow ochre, I would go over that spot with a different color, such as crimson, perhaps. And my paper is not quite dry just yet, but it's dry enough for our purposes. And if it's a little blurry, that's fine. That just helps give us that illusion of blurriness that we get from atmospheric perspective. So I quite like the yellow ochre color. And as I get closer to the edges of my page, this is theoretically closer to me as the viewer, I'm going to try to use larger and larger brush strokes. I'm trying to keep the areas where my trees will be a little bit sparse. And it's a lot of little brush strokes. And if this takes you a long time, that is okay, because this just means that it's giving our mountain a nice long time to dry. I'm also going to try to come in with my fan brush a little bit. And with my fan brush, it's a little hard to get it into these little half pans, but you can see the fan brush allows for some different textures in our brush strokes. This is an art, it is not an exact science, so you will decide when you are done with your leaves. And we will come back and add the tree trunks in a little bit, but first we are going to go back to our mountain. In my palette, I don't really have the right color for our back mountain. It's this kind of darkish purple gray color, and I don't really have that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix my own color. So I'm going to start by using some black. And I'm just squeezing it out, trying to lift as much pigment as I can, and then squeezing it out into this little paint palette. And then I am going to come in with my purple color. And it's all just looking very inky right now, which is natural. I am also going to add some of this cyan blue. And mix it all together, and I'm going to test on a spare piece of watercolor paper to see if that's the color that I want. Right now I'm seeing that it's definitely a little bit too much on the blue side, and I still want some of that purpliness. So I'm going to rinse off my brush, and I'm going to add some magenta, because magenta and cyan make purple. There's that color. Okay. So I know that I said that I was going to retire my wide water pen brush, but it's not quite time for it to go just yet. It has one last job to do, and it is this back mountain. So I'm going to dip it into the color that I just mixed. And I am going to carefully trace out outline of the mountain. I'm going to pull that color further down, squeezing out a little bit more water from my water brush as I go. I'm going to dip back in. And I do definitely want my entire mountain to be coated in this color, but I want the darkest part to be at the tip of the mountain, whereas the rest of it I want to kind of fade into a bit more of a lighter, almost like an ombre. So making sure that I use a lot of water from my water barrel. Going to go back in and add just a little bit more pigment to the top of that mountain. The top of the mountain, I think, is the darkest area, and I want to make sure that there's a lot of pigment there. Okay. We will let that dry and come back to our mountain in a bit. Back to our leafy forest. If you look closely at the example picture, the trees are not just brown. They seem to have different gradients in them. I see blue, I see purple, I see pink, and I'm feeling very inspired by all of these colors that I'm seeing in the trees. And I think that it would make for a very nice landscape if we incorporated some of those colors into it. That said, I do also want to be mindful of our atmospheric perspective. We know that as objects move further into the distance, they get bluer. So I think that the trees closest to this spot of haziness are going to be a very light blue, which we can test on our spare watercolor paper. And the trees closest to us are going to be more of a rich magenta. And again, just like our underpainting for the mountain, we can come over these again with a darker color to kind of tone down just how bright and vibrant these colors are. But I think it makes sense to start with a vibrant color and then tone it down afterwards in a landscape, because landscapes are all about seeing color and trying to capture the vibrance of nature. So, using my water brush pen, I am going to first start with the trees closest to me. And I am going to paint these I know this looks a little kooky right now. Just have faith in the process. And I didn't exactly draw out where the branches would be, so I'm just drawing those branches in right now, trying to make sure that I leave room for the leaves to still show through. I'm going to paint this tree on this side magenta as well. And I'm not quite sure that that magenta is a dark enough color, so I'm going to go over it a little bit too with some crimson. To get it to appear darker. Remember, the things in front of us have the most contrast, so we really want these trees in the front to look very dark. Okay. Now the trees slightly farther away, I'm going to paint a purple color. Carefully painting around my leaves. And I'm also not afraid to get in front of my leaves either. Remember, some leaves are behind, some leaves are in front. Imagining a little bit of a tree here. And finally, for the trees in the back, I am going to paint them blue. However, I want to make sure that my blue is very watered down. Remember, we want to use a lot of water So I'm using my paint palette this time not to mix another color. I'm going to use the cyan as is, but I want to be sure that when I paint the blue, it's very very faint on the page, as opposed to the thick color. I'm going to add just a little bit more water. There we go. We're going to draw a tree on this side as well. Very faint. Then I'm going to devote even more water to this so that the tree can barely be seen. There we go. Okay. So we have that faded effect going back, and we have the blue that's receding backwards with our bright red color up front. We will wait for this to dry one more time, and we are going to work on the mountain again. Okay. So I can see that our mountain dried here, and I had a little bit too much water, as you can see. It pooled up and it bloomed. I actually like this. It gives some detail to the mountain. There is that ridge just underneath right here that follows this line pretty evenly. So I think this is actually a happy accident. I would not know how to recreate it because sometimes watercolor is just uncontrollable and it does what it wants to do. But this does happen when you have too much water on the page. So next up, we are going to draw in the darker lines on the mountain closest to us. We saw that it was a very deep green color, and we are going to mix a color again. I'm going to mix the deep green, which is a great color, but it's just a little bit too blue for our purposes. But we want a lot of that green in there as the basis for our color. And then in color theory, you learn that when you want to make a color darker or less vibrant, you actually add the opposite on the color wheel. So I know that the opposite of green on the color wheel is going to be a kind of reddish magenta. I don't know that I necessarily want to completely make this a complete dark color. So I'm going to use some colors that are around it, such as this burnt sienna. Burnt sienna still has a lot of those red tones. But I think when mixed to our deep green, you can see there it creates a nice rich brown, green rather. I know my colors. I'm going to start by making the trees on the mountain edge. And to make these trees, it might actually be better not to use the water brush, but a traditional brush. I'm going to start just by creating a line and then flicking out a few times to create the appearance of branches. And I'm going to repeat that process over and over again as I go down the mountain. I'm noticing there's some trees that overlap each other. There's some trees that go further down on the mountain edge than others. Just making sure that I'm using that deep green color. They go pretty far down the mountain. I'm going to go ahead and skip to my last little tree so that I know where my finish line is. And then it's actually up to you. You can use that same deep green for the houses, or you can use the same purplish color that we used for the mountain in the back. I'm going to use that purplish color to draw a very simple house. And then I'm also going to draw some shadow. And then there was another little house and some shadow. Also with this purple color, I'm going to go in and trace that swooshy, swoopy road. It's very hard to see with the watercolor on top of it, but the lines were there. And now with my watercolor brush, I'm going to go back in with that dark green color that we used for the trees. And I am going to start painting the dark lines on the hill. So this takes a little bit of brush control. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to paint a little bit with the tip, and then I'm going to really dig in and hopefully get a thicker line. And then I'm going to go back to the tip, and hopefully that's going to give us a little bit of an irregular line that starts out thin, goes thick, goes back thin, goes back thick, depending on where I was when I was pressing down. So. I'm noticing this nice thick line of darkness in the hillside, so I'm going to go ahead and draw that in as well. And it kind of evens out, and then it kind of continues back down. Our house is looking fairly dry now, so I'm not too worried about it. It is going to get brushed over with some of that dark green to indicate that this part of the hill is in shadow. I'm really trying to capture the irregularity of this mountain with these thin, thick, thin lines. Now that we have some more of the mountain drawn in, we can draw a few more trees in the middle of the mountain. Okay, we are going to let this layer dry on our mountain. And we are going to turn back around to our forest scene. This is where we will kind of go back over these trees that we have painted these kind of wild colors. and we will go over them with a darker color. So I'm going to mix a brown color with my burnt umber. And this time I'm going to darken it with a little bit of black. And I'm adding a little bit of water to it so that hopefully when we apply it onto our paper, we still get to see a little bit of that vibrance of the color underneath. And I'm just tracing back over our magenta trees, and I'm going to trace back over our purple trees. Noticing that I didn't mix quite a lot of this dark brown color, and that's okay. I'm just using it to tone down a little bit of that fantastic color. And as for the blue trees in the background, I don't necessarily want to cover them up a lot at all. I'm going to add a lot of water to this color because we don't want to make this blue darker, right? We want to keep it faded. We just want to maybe tone it down a smidge. The wonderful thing about watercolor is that you can never really tell when you're done. To me, this is done for me, but if you find yourself wanting to add a little bit more detail to the leaves, if you want to add just a little bit more color, then absolutely feel free to on your own painting. For me, this is done for the forest scene. And as for the mountain scene, I'm looking back at it and I'm looking back at our reference image, and I'm not seeing too much left to do. I think the one thing that I really just want to do now is add a little bit more trees in this shaded area. To really get that dark green color. I'm going to add one last tree. Okay. And now I would call this done for our mountain as well. The last thing that we have to do is we just have to carefully peel back the drafting tape. So this is the very satisfying part for a lot of people. Typically wait until your project is dry, but I'm feeling a little impatient today. And we are done. I hope that you learned something about how to watercolor your own landscapes and that you've learned some helpful techniques as you go out and explore the world around you and hopefully get inspired by some views to paint your own landscapes.